Welcome, everyone. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat.
Hello, good afternoon. Great to see a number of our members. Okay, so I'm just going to say a very quick welcome. My name's Cynthia Loren. For those that don't know me, I'm one of the founders here at ACGC. And it's, wonderful to have this as our very first session of the year in partnership with ACC. I won't be saying very much at all today, other than just to remind you that if you're not yet a member, we'd encourage you to join. Membership of ACGC is absolutely free, and we have a very exciting program this year, including this session, a session next month and the month after, and then a massive conference in Ghana in October. So we'll be sharing many more details about that. As you come into the session today, it would be great if you can just share your LinkedIn details, connect with those of us that are in the session today. But I'm going to stop there and then hand over to Andrew just to introduce the ACC and what's happening today. So thank you, everyone, and let's have a great session.
Thank you, Cynthia. Welcome, everyone. My name is Antje Tiegler. I'm the Senior Director of Membership Initiatives and Chapters at the Association of Corporate Counsel. We are an association of 45,000 members in 114 countries. We believe in the power of global community. And we are not only offering a global network, but we are also offering vast resources. And we will be sharing with you a few at the end of the session that we hope will help you on your legal innovation journey. But without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our session host, Hans Albert, to kick off our webinar on adapting and striving.
Well, thank you, Antje, and it's always a pleasure to talk to this great community. First time for me to also talk to the community in Africa through ACGC. What Antje didn't mention, that I used to be involved very much with ACC as a board member for ACC Europe a few years ago. But since then, I've joined Deloitte, where our legal consulting practice. And one of the things that we definitely talk a lot about is legal operations. It's a hot topic anywhere, I would say, about efficiency improvements for a legal function. And it doesn't matter whether the function is small or big. I think everybody faces challenges in terms of efficiencies and getting the work done. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about process improvements and legal operations and change management for today. And for this, we have a great panel who will introduce themselves as well, but I will introduce the panel briefly. We look forward to a great discussion today. We have questions and answers at the end, but we encourage you to take also post questions in the chat during the session, and we'll try to respond to these as well. I should also mention that all the panel members speak on their personal expression of personal opinions, not on behalf of their companies, and I think we appreciate that. It's not true for me. I speak on behalf of myself and Deloitte. It doesn't matter. Let me introduce the panel, and then we'll kick right into the sort of more deep the discussion around change management and legal operations. And let me just say one thing around change management, because it's a very complex matter, I think, for every organization. It's not a legal problem. It's a problem that's affecting every organization. And change management is really all about getting extraordinary things done through people. This is why you see that a lot of change management experts have a background in psychology. But there are also a lot of misconceptions about how to achieve the best changes in any organizations. And it's not a simple thing. It's not a burning platform. That's the wrong analogy to use. It's also not a technical problem, nor is it a specific part of a a work stream within a project. It's really something that affects every change in any organization, and that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about process improvements, because that's a very important part of a legal operations role and any legal function. And I will say some more about that later. But let me introduce the panel. Let me start with Teresa Chikwendu from MTN in Nigeria, and I'll let her introduce herself in a bit more detail later. We have Faith Mungini, and I probably got that wrong again. Sorry, Faith, from the Trade Development Bank, heading up senior legal operations manager at the bank. And finally on the panel we have Thomasin Ulumijiva. Probably also got that wrong, but she was the former general counsel of LG Electronics in West Africa. And we look forward to a great discussion today with this esteemed panel. So maybe we can switch back to that. So maybe I'll give the floor to the panelists to do a further brief introduction of themselves, bit of background, and sharing an example of any change management project that you've led in your organization. And why don't you start with that, Faith, as the first one?
Well, thank you very much, Hans, and thank you for just driving us to this point. My name is Faith Monyinyi. I'm a Senior Legal Operations Officer here at Trade and Development Bank, based in Nairobi, Kenya. By way of background, my background is I had just slightly over 10 years of management consulting experience at Deloitte, and a finance background as well. Mm-hmm. So I am the pioneer legal operations specialist here at TDB. So my story of change is really on a global level. It was really focused on across the operations, the foundational bit being just crystallizing different policies and ways of doing things. And then now comes the layer of technology. So impact is internally within the organization and externally with the external counsel that we utilize across the 25 member states that we operate in. So change has been big, and maybe I'll stop there and just hand over to my fellow panelist, Teresa, as well, to introduce herself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faith, for that introduction. My name is Teresa Chikwendu. I'm the head of department corporate transactions at MTN Nigeria. MTN Nigeria is located in Lagos, Nigeria. I oversee and manage the contracts, corporate transactions team, the business partnering, legal advisory, as well as legal operations team. So it's sort of like a full, view and full circle. I was also part of the team, so the legal and operations team, was first established, around the time I joined. So of course, there was a lot of learning and, implementing. In my spare time, I run a column on LinkedIn called Diary of an In-House Counsel. So I encourage you to, go and follow.
Okay, thank you very much. Thomasin.
And then, we share ideas.
You good?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Good day, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Thomasin Ulumijiva. I'm a compliance professional. I offer compliance advisory to companies and individuals. And, I also focus primarily on privacy and data protection. I was, as you can see, former general counsel for LG Electronics, and I was invited to sort of structure the legal operations there because at the time, most of the legal operations wasn't done in-house. So that had me doing a whole lot of things, which is contract management, trying to introduce new tools and processes, and, just basically helping to manage the legal and compliance risk. I also have a background in finance, doing financial planning for over 3 years. So most of the things I'll speak about today will also touch on budget. And, my role at LG as well, because I did fantastic in legal, I was then like a few years into the legal work, I started doing core change management for organizational change as a whole. So my points here, or my comments here, would touch on the legal aspects and my learning from actual change management techniques for even organizational change, and how it's important to manage the people aspect of change in everything that you do. So I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to the session. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you. So let's go back to some examples of a change management project, and maybe one of you can touch on an example, but also speak on some of the challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome these challenges? How did you solve for this? Because as we, I guess, all know, that with change there is also resistance, right? So you need to figure out a way of how to navigate through the resistance that would exist in pretty much any organization. I've been around in many years in many organizations, and there is always some resistance to any change, whether it's a change of way of working. I think the cliche is a little bit that lawyers are particularly difficult to change. I'm not sure that's true. I think they're just very smart, and therefore very critical of any change, and like to question things and like to debate and argue. But it's also good to have people with a finance background in our panel to talk about the changes. So who wants to go first on talking about an example on a change management project that you've worked on? Thomasin, maybe you want to go first? Picking on you.
I didn't see that coming. Okay. So like I said, I was invited, or I joined LG, to sort of structure legal operations. So I'll just talk about how I operationalized compliance risk management. I started off analyzing or assessing the company, where they were at the point, the direction they wanted to focus on at that time. And, funny, there was also a regulation at the time on privacy. So while I was doing like the general metrics for compliance, which, horizontal trade, money laundering, and all of that, there was the primary focus on privacy, because at the time in Nigeria, it was important for companies to do like the audit. So, and in my assessment, like I said, I did budgeting for a bit. In my assessment, I'd seen that expenses for marketing operations were being expended on some claims from privacy issues, and so my primary focus was to sort of nip that in the bud, right, by implementing privacy by design elements to ensure that issues are not escalated beyond what they were supposed to be. So that resulted in me, ensuring that for all marketing activities that were to be done, there was sort of like a reporting process, right? So when you pre-report, then we analyze and do the privacy impact assessment before you can launch the program. So also related to product managers, before they launch a product or a software, all of that privacy element needed to be checked and confirmed before products were launched. So that's one of the examples of, my change management activities in LG Electronics.
And did you run into any particular resistance? Did you have people who really try to sort of be difficult in the change, or not? Maybe you were lucky to not have any resistance.
Oh, Hans, I think resistance is a standard thing for change, right? And lawyers also have the cultural resistance, in that people believe that ideas stop at lawyers, or ideas fail at lawyers, or you don't get to launch their product because you want to do an extra check. So that resistance was definitely experienced. But I also understand people, it wasn't necessarily intentional. The change we were bringing about was going to change their job role. It was going to probably give them an extra step. So you would expect that there'll be resistance. It's just a general thing to disruption, right? Disruption will result in resistance. So it's how you manage the disruption that determines the success of the change or the process improvement you're trying to achieve. So definitely experience resistance, but there were also successes as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Teresa, maybe your example, maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience.
Yes, thank you, Hans. So in my experience, it has to do with a contract, from a contract perspective, which is where me and Tommy differ. So from the contract perspective, one of the change management I wanted to implement was a standardization of our contract process. So, for you to get into, the use of technology, one of the things you must understand, is the process to get there. And the process of getting there is through the standardization, of your contract template. Yeah. So what did we do? It was a question of setting the vision. Once the vision was set, it was then again, selling it to, to the person that to my manager, and then have just so that you deal with the initial resistance to change that we've already alluded to. And then when you get their buy-in, because you're not able to batch the contracts, right? By standardization, you're able to batch it, simple, semi-simple, and then complex contracts. After we had gone through that stage and we were batched contracts, the next stage was to sell it to our stakeholders. And so how did we go through that process? It was having meetings with the different stakeholders, different divisions, the needs of your different teams or departments, as we call it in MTN, are different. And so you have to sell the vision to them. So to my marketing team, I'm selling to them that, you want speed to market. And so if we do it in this way, it's going to be tough initially, but I'm able to assure you that you get your contracts within, say, 5 number of days. For my sales team, I'm telling them that, all you want is speed to market so you can get revenue, right? So if you support me on this process, you get your contracts within X number of days. With all of that in mind and getting the buy-in of stakeholders. And when you're getting the buy-in of stakeholders, it's not just at the top level. It has to be, from the bottom, the middle, and the top. And then you need, your stakeholders to sell the vision, both to their bosses and to the people on the street who would implement that. So when all of that is done, you then engage your external stakeholders. And then from there, you start to see wins. When you see wins, I advise that you celebrate and publicize it, so that you're able to capitalize on that to, enable people to see the vision. It takes a while to actually get, the result you want, to achieve that change management vision. But if you're focused and the team is focused, it's doable. Thank you.
Yeah, you touch upon a couple of really good points there, Teresa, in any change. These are true in any change process. But you mentioned a couple of things, vision, right? Why are we doing this? I think it's always very important to, if you're changing anything, in your example around, the contracts, and I'll have an example as well, maybe we can touch on that as well. But I think, why are we doing this? Why is the change? If it's an organizational change, you also need to explain of why are we doing this and what is the benefit to everyone in the organization, right? I think the buy-in you mentioned also, get the buy-in from the stakeholders is critical. I think also, more generally, I think if you're in legal operations or you're a general counsel or a divisional general counsel, you need to get the buy-in from the other stakeholders as well, and your boss and your CFO and whoever else is involved. And finally, I think the interesting point you mentioned is celebrate wins, right? Celebrate the small successes. Every time you make a step in the right direction and it's the right thing to do, make it clear that's a success. Celebrate the wins. It doesn't have to be a whole song and dance, but it's it could be important. I think that's a really good point. Faith.
Thank you, Hans. Yes, sure. Thank you, Hans. I have quite a few examples, but I'll toggle into one particular change management initiative that I was spearheading. That was the implementation of an e-billing system, just to streamline billing and all the value adds that come with e-billing. Again, the stakeholder buy-in, I can't underscore that. The senior management buy-in as well is very critical. But in this case, we had 2 sets of stakeholders that needed to be closely managed. The first one is the internal stakeholders, where, like you said, dealing with a team of lawyers, the one thing's a certain way. And here you're bringing a change that involves doing things slightly different. Right. Why can't we just do receive PDF invoices and process them as we did before? Why do we have to have this this system in place? And then the second set of stakeholders that I had to manage is the external stakeholders from the law firms that we deal with, the in-country law firms in the different jurisdictions, where in some cases there was challenges in technology. Why you bring in a system? How, will I be able to do this? So really, just for the journey of that implementation, right from the start is to involve the internal stakeholders in mapping the requirements and sharing the value so that they could own this. And then along the journey, have crystallized training sessions, and then also making available recordings of the training sessions so that someone doesn't have to keep feeling like they have to come back and ask questions, so that that can be led individually. So if I have a question, I can go back to that little place where it was taught. Another thing in that change management was to make available quick reference guides, so that a sort of cheat sheet for users to say, okay, I've forgotten which button to press. They can go and reference the quick reference guide, and then that just helps them begin to adopt it. Initially, upon implementation, there was the number of calls or the number of reports of, I can't do this, I'm stuck, I really don't like this system, was significant. And now, 3 years into using the system and seeing what data is being churned out of the system from different analytics, and they're like, whoa, you mean we can have that information? You mean we can tell how many analysts vis-a-vis of counsel or partners were working on our matters? So the benefit is now coming to fruition. But just to underscore the importance of communication and hand-holding where necessary.
I think that's a really good point. I think, especially on the communication, I think one of the things I always say with any change project, whether we advise clients or whether we're doing something ourselves, I think communication cannot be underestimated. The importance of communication, I mentioned already, explaining the why, and you need to continually do that, right? Because it's not like the first slide at the beginning of the project and then you never talk about why anymore. It's a constant given. You need to talk about why are we doing this and remind them, and then link it into making progress and seeing the benefits and celebrating the wins that Teresa was talking about. I think that's crucial. So you can't communicate enough, I think, on a change project and a changing your way of working. One thing that I've personally always found very helpful is to identify, you tend to identify who's resisting the change, but you also need to look for who are your champions of change. Who are the people that are going to help you, because you can't do it on your own. And there will be people in your team, in the organization, could be your manager, but usually not, right? I mean, usually it's somewhere in your organization, people who will help you drive the change. I think that's really helpful to put that forward, as well as, find your champions of change. One of the things that I've done in particularly around implementing technology, a new technology like you were talking about, Faith, an e-billing system. And yes, you will get a lot of resistance because it's definitely changing the way of working. But the outside counsel will definitely push back as well, because they don't like it. It's just extra admin for them. Doesn't matter, right? I think there is a benefit for you, and that's all that counts because you're the client. I think but the sort of, if you have a user group of people who will help you identify what the tool does and how successful it is, and they can actually communicate that as well within their own teams, within the organization, that will help you quite a lot, I think. So let's move on to more specifically looking at legal process improvements. And I think one of the areas that a legal operations organization looks at is how can we make our processes in the organization more efficient and improve these. And that's comes with its own sets of challenges, right? Whether there could be, again, change management, could be regulatory requirements or lack of resources. Can you talk about your experience, Teresa, in terms of creating an environment for process improvement in the organization, and how do you best introduce new technologies?
Thank you very much, Hans, for that question. I think the first thing you need to do, is something you had, initially alluded to, is to find your champions. I find that if you find your champions, within the organization, they will sell the vision, both upwards and downwards. And so, I'll give you a practical example. So, I also do, one of the things we do internally is roadshows. And during that roadshows, we're able to meet with the different divisions, have tailored presentations to speak to their specific needs. So during that roadshows, we sort of brainstorm with them and we exchange ideas. Since we're here to also talk about, the wins and the losses, I'll talk about, the losses. So in this instance, we had a roadshow and it didn't go so well because, it was one of the sales team and, they want their contracts in 24 hours, when they make the request. And of course, legal is serving the entire business. So it's a bit of a juggling act. And for them, it's tough because, their KPI is to bring in revenue to the business. And during one of these sessions, it was extremely heated and everybody was, tensed on both sides. For us, and in the legal department, we're feeling unappreciated because, we were burnt out serving the business and, our users, are not appreciating, the work that we did. And so how did one of our influencers break the ice? He spoke up for us and said to the team that, guys, let's put this in context. This is a team of X number of people serving the entire division. And I think that was able to calm the tensions. And so after that meeting, we then said to ourselves, we're all upset, but where do we go from here? How do we resolve this issue? And the result was the C executive having a chat with my C executive to say, we need an additional resource. These guys are stretched. And in getting that resource, what we agreed was that resource was going to be dedicated to that entire division. And that was a win for us because we got a resource that was dedicated to them. They were able to train that resource to understand their needs as a team. They were able to get that resource to speak their language. So the resource would enter into meetings and talk like a technical person, but of course, wearing the legal hat. That was a win for legal department. I tell you, within a couple of months, they were inviting me to come back for another show because they were like, it's going to be good news. And so that's really what you do. So just to add, to that really, know your sponsors, ask yourself, during the roadshows, what did we do well? What didn't we do well? What can we do better? And then send out clients service, feedback, where your users will give you feedback, and then you can brainstorm with them, like I said earlier, and then implement process to implement, changes, to better, your process for process improvement. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, no, I like the idea of the roadshows. That's really helpful. And again, it's a way of creating buy-in and understanding and helping them move forward. I think, by the way, one of the things when you're looking at process improvement I usually say process improvement comes after process analysis, right? You need to first understand what processes there are, if any. Sometimes, it's not clear. Just by merely looking at the process. I remember a situation where I was introducing a particular type of contract certification, and by looking at the process, we discovered that different regions were doing different things, and we didn't know. We had no idea. We knew that processes existed around this particular template agreement, but it was done in different ways. It was done different in Asia than it was done in the US, and it was in Europe. So just by looking at and analyzing the process, we identified different processes so we could harmonize and create one process instead of having 3 or 4. I also think, and I see this a lot with clients, especially around contracting, that they buy a contracting tool, a contract management tool, and that tool requires a certain process. So if you haven't got a process, if you haven't got a contracting process, you can't automate it. If you have a good process, you can automate it. But if you don't, and the mistake that is often made is that they believe that by buying a tool, let's put it that way, buying a new tool will automate the process. And that's not true. If you automate a broken process, it's still going to be a broken process, except that it's an automated broken process, but it doesn't help you, right? So I think that's one of the things I learned many years ago. Thomason, maybe you can talk a little bit about process improvement as well, your experience, and what sort of support do you need? What challenges have you faced?
Thank you, Hans. Just like you said, one of the first things I do is to assess the company, right? Assess the processes, the vision or the direction for the year, assess the stakeholders to know how to prioritize the engagement of the stakeholders in terms of their categorization or influence, right? And I also do something called expense evaluation, because when you check the budget planning of a company, sometimes their expense for legal, for instance, me, or like Faith's example, to when people who just pioneer a process, when you join, you need to check these things because you don't really know how they might have been operating before. So to know how they operate, the budget tells a story. So when you check the budget and see what was expended on legal, right, you can tell, why do we keep spending so and so amount on this issue? How can we ensure that there's early risk prevention? What are the activities we can do in-house to ensure that it doesn't get to the point of spending this much money? So expense evaluation helps to know what process to put in place. If you have previous reports from maybe consultants or even in-house or memos shared by different teams on anything, you need to evaluate those reports. You can also do surveys for your teams to sort of feel their pulse and know their pain points, right? So maybe, like during COVID, you couldn't get contracts out quickly because maybe the authorized signatory wasn't around and you couldn't sign. Okay, so do we need to implement an e-signature process? Do our laws allow that, right? Because I remember like after COVID, we needed to do something like that for our contracts. And thankfully, the Evidence Act was updated to accept, electronic documents as valid. So, these are the evaluations you need to do to understand the process improvement for your company. Then you also need to know, okay, for your team members, what are their workflows like? What processes are duplicated? You're talking about compliance. How many times do we have to ask them questions on, what are the risks you have? Who's the risk owner? Can we just have it, streamlined in a particular place so that your team members are not inundated with questions over and over again? Because that bores them and it sort of leads to complacency or laziness when you keep asking them over and over again. They feel like you're just ticking a box, right? You're not really doing the things that you say you want to do because you've asked them before. So you need to streamline your questions or your interview process. And, just when you've done that, then you can know the readiness of the company and the stakeholders for the process you want to implement, and particularly to compliance. Because like I said, I'll be speaking to compliance for maybe the compliance managers here. I do something called a risk heat map. I mentioned earlier that I have like a matrix I check for all the risk points for the company, depending on your industry, right? Then you check the risk heat map to know, okay, what's the highest one? Which one has more financial exposure? Which one should we focus on, primarily right now? So those are the things I look at. Then maybe if you're into litigation, matter management, which cases went to court, how much do we expend on external counsel? How can we ensure that, the matter doesn't get to us expending on external counsel? I mean, that's great for external counsel in terms of their money, but for you internally, every company wants to minimize their budget. So these are some of the ways I, ensure that I implement process to customize my recommendation for the company and for the stakeholder. And of course, early engagement of the stakeholders after this assessment, because you're interviewing them, right? So you're already engaging them and sort of preparing their minds for whatever improvements you're bringing on board. So that's really my experience on process improvement.
You have a background in finance, right?
Yes,
I think that's probably helpful when it comes to these discussions around business cases and budgets and all that, because
Yes.
I know, and I think Faith also has a background in finance. It's interesting, right? I think in legal operations, you don't always need a legal background. A finance background or an operations background can be quite helpful, because one of the things that lawyers often struggle with is the business case for change and improvements. Because that's sometimes a challenge to have a business case for a new system or contract management tool or whatever. So that's sometimes quite challenging. So I think having a finance background is helpful, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay, Faith, what about you? I mean, you have a sort of maybe a different perspective, or do you share the previous speakers on the panel in terms of their views on this?
Yeah, and thank you, Hans, and thank you, fellow panelists. I do share the same view in terms of bringing in the change. So what change are you bringing in? So, what I'll do, and I think I'll just echo just a few sentiments briefly, but just it's important to map where you are as a department, in this case, the in-house legal department here. So do an assessment. Where are we? What are we doing? And then benchmark those findings against where other peers are within the market and also in the backdrop of best practice globally, and then out of that phase of the benchmarking, developing a rollout strategy is critical. And you then map out the priority initiatives that you'll be undertaking. So that's sort of a wholesome way of mapping out so that it's not, oh, we're doing this year, and the next year we come up with and flag off something new. There's actually a context of this is what we're changing over the next 2 to 3, 4 years, and this is where we want to be at the tail end of those changes. So for the gap analysis, it might be useful depending on the different capabilities that are internal to the organization. You could go out and get a consultant to help you and work with you to do that gap analysis, because really in-house or internally, you know what you know based on what you've been doing, but an external eye will then just pinpoint different things from the market. And efficiency and stakeholder satisfaction is very critical. And what I mean by that is that you engage them early on to say, where your pain points, let's establish that and feed that into that strategy, implementation strategy. Some of the challenges, I've come across is, different stakeholders will have the fear of the unknown or the reluctance to adopt to new ways of doing things. So again, the soft approach, just the knowledge sharing, this is what's going to happen. It's not all bad, but the primary thing foundationally that we need to do as change agents is really to establish clear requirements and always involve the business teams in defining those requirements. In my case, in some forms, we did small focus groups to create buy-in. So if the solution was going across the organization, you could have touch points with different business units on a one-on-one, and they'll feel heard. And they'll share their messaging with you to help you with the solution that you're trying to bring to the table. I can't underscore the support of the business leaders and the general counsel is very critical in driving this change, because then from that strategic level, whatever initiatives or whatever tools you need to have the change stick can be brought in, be it including the use of the new technology in the BSCs or balance scorecards or whichever other tools, then coming from that senior leadership level really helps drive these change initiatives. Yeah, so I'd say
it's good points, Faith. And thanks for mentioning that you should get a consultant. Always good. Always very good. But I think, I'm just kidding. I think you mentioned also the benchmarking and the best practices and looking externally. I think one of the things why organizations like, the ACC and ACGC are important is also to make that connection with the community. And in my experience, legal operations people and lawyers in general really like to talk about their work and really like to share best practices and share ideas and examples. I think ACC, I don't know about ACGC, but ACC has definitely a whole lot of information around the benchmarking available in terms of documentation, surveys, key benchmarks and reports available that you can compare with. I think that's quite helpful as well. And sometimes you only need a few benchmarks to compare to understand whether you're on the right track with your organization, whether you're doing the right things. And that brings me also to my sort of next question. I think if you've gone through all this and going through these changes, how do you then measure and define the success for the things that you've done, and how do you measure the effectiveness of your legal function? Do you have key objectives to measure whether the improvements are effective? How do you look at this? Who wants to talk about this? Teresa, maybe? I mean, I think this is important for a legal operations. Our role is to also define what are your objectives and how do you measure the efficiency of your organization, and are the things working? Are your clients happy? Do you do client surveys internally, or maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Sure, thanks for that. So just like we said, initially, one of the things you can do is to clearly, articulate the mission and vision statement, of the legal department, and ensure that, it's tailored to the organization. So I'll give an example. In my company at the moment, everyone is focused on Ambition 2025 and the overarching objective across, the opcos, that's the operating companies, and the group. And so when you cascade that to the legal department, what that means is that, you're going to need to support your various departments to achieve that objective. So if someone is coming to you, say, for a technical contract, you need to understand, that there's a vision, there's a mission behind that. They're not just coming to you to implement, but there's a broader goal, achieving revenue, achieving KPIs to the regulator, to our customers, and the like. The next thing is to set the tone in terms of the mindset, right? You want everybody on the team to have a certain mindset, which is solutions driven and process, driven. So Thomas had, alluded to the point earlier, which is, when you do those surveys, so you're able to get feedback, from the entire team on what do we do better. And sometimes, the people in the field, doing the work are actually the best people to get those ideas from. When you get their buy-in and you get those ideas, you're then able to crystallize and then do your surveys. And so you can get bespoke responses, from your user department. Roadshows are important, and I've spoken about that, but I wouldn't delve on it anymore. But there's a flip to the roadshows. And I've seen that, for the past +1+ years in my company. So what that happens is that the departments have sort of like a stakeholder engagement where they invite vendors, to come in, and then they it's sort of like a refresher, like putting face to the people that you're exchanging emails with and doing business with. So what do we do as legal? We ensure that we're on the agenda. By getting on the agenda, you get to speak to vendors, you get to speak to the suppliers, and you sort of have an exchange, so what's the pinpoint? What do you want to know about our contract? What do you think, causes the delays in you executing our contracts? Why are we having feedback on these particular clauses? And we had that a couple of times. We even had, our IP team make a presentation. So just to put this in context, we had a supplier forum for the digital team, for the supplier team, and for customer relations. For our digital team, IP was very critical, to the vendors, and they needed to hear from the IP department. So a presentation was done. And they were able to exchange ideas to understand, the purpose of some of the exchanges, why we need to protect ourselves from an intellectual property perspective, why they also need to ensure that, when they're coming to deal with us, they've ticked all the boxes and, they've gotten all the necessary approvals. Communication is also key. I've talked about celebrating your win, but you also need to communicate that. A survey, thankfully, Hans spoke about ACC reports. A survey that was done by ACC recently actually alluded to the fact that legal operations professionals said that communication was the number one quality for success. And it's interesting because you talk about a finance background, but finance was down. It wasn't one of the top three. Relationship management was down. It wasn't one of the top three. And then, relationship currency, data analytics. Personally, I was surprised because what that shows is a commonality between what we face as in-house lawyers and what legal operational professionals face. You must communicate, and communicate.
I agree.
You have to emphasize that. So communicate and collaborate, and then that would definitely place your legal department on the pathway to success. Every legal team wants to be the best, right? So it's always international best standards and practices. Yeah, we're competitive like that. Lawyers are competitive, and we own it with pride. So with that in mind, I'm sure that your legal department will be set the international standard that you desire. Thank you.
Thank you. Good points. Thanks, Rez. By the way, I encourage people to put questions in this chat. We have time for questions at the end, but if you have a sort of an immediate question that you'd like to raise with the panel, obviously put them in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go along. So Faith, in terms of the sort of how do you measure the department and how do you look at that from your perspective? What key objectives? Do you have any sort of financial objectives or KPIs, anything like that, or not yet? I mean, I know it's always lawyers sometimes will argue that what they do cannot be measured. I disagree. I tend to disagree with that, but maybe you can talk a little bit about this too.
Yeah, thank you, Hans. I think I admire, Teresa's sentiments quite largely, but I think one of the things that is the output or the measure of the improvement processes that have come in is how well are we serving our customers, both internally and externally. So in our case, we run regular surveys, client surveys, and invite them to speak to different aspects of the services that they're receiving. We also run like SLA calls to say how satisfied are you on our delivery within the parameters of the SLA we have with you as our business users. And so, so we put in that framework to just hold ourselves accountable and to have that transparency to say, hey guys, this is how we want to serve you. And you can speak back to us through this different fora. In terms of the measurements on a lower level, on an operational level, the savings we make from, invoices that were adjusted can easily be reported upon. So I can get how much was saved by invoice reductions for various reasons, that external counsel may have submitted, and for various reasons the invoice was reduced. How much is that? What's the quantum of that saving? How long are we taking to pay external counsel, for instance? So those are measures that you can, at the tip of your fingers, be able to have, and even as you're engaging external counsel, then asking them, how are we performing? We know we're your clients, but how are we performing as well as we measure them for their service rendering to us as an organization. So I think the objectives that you set out at the start will then define what it is those initiatives were set to derive. And it's always good to just go back to that ground level at the ideation phase to say, what was it we wanted to achieve? Are we achieving it? What enhancements can we get? A key thing to do is to regularly engage, and I'll speak on the technology platform for this, regularly engage your solution providers to say, how are we doing against the market? What do you think we can improve? How are we utilizing your system? How far can we go? What else can we do within the context of what we have at the moment? I think I'll stop there, but just the measure is really what did you set out to do, and how are you measuring against what you set out to do?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That's really very true. It's a great discussion, guys. I think I'm just looking at the clock, and we are already far in, and there's still a lot to talk about, I think. So we may need to speed it up a little bit for the rest of the discussion, so we make sure that we can cover as much as possible of the things that we wanted to talk about. Maybe moving on a little bit in terms of looking at collaboration between the legal function and the rest of the business. And you guys already touched upon it a little bit, but maybe, Thomasin, maybe you can also talk about a little bit the sort of, the collaboration, the missions of the organization. How do you deal with that? And how do you deal with the alignment of legal with the rest of the organization?
All right. So everyone knows that legal requires, you need to have cross-functional collaboration for success, because if you're talking about change management and process improvement, you want to get to the adoption phase. So, when you said, how do you measure the impact? If you're going to measure the impact, everybody, for instance, if you wanted to address something on contracts, you want to check, has the time for rolling out contracts, have we been able to save some time? Have we gotten to the end of contracts to ensure that the business team have moved forward? The guidance notes, are they being used? The training for compliance, are people attending? So collaboration with other teams, if they were not on board at first, you might not get to that adoption phase. And adoption might be in stages, right? So you should also be realistic in terms of your expectations. You might not have 100% adoption. It might be phased out depending on the readiness and the maturity of the company and the team you have. So, but I know that collaboration is very important. And I'll give you an example. Imagine your objective was to do trainings, and maybe the legal team doesn't have training, and you don't have a budget for even external consultants to come on board to train your team. If you had collaborated with your HR department, there's a way the HR department can couch that training to be under the HR budget, because many times the HR department have tons of budget, right? Yeah. So there's a way they can couch that training to be offered under their platform with their budget. That's collaboration. Now, one of us mentioned something about reward and appreciating the progress you've made. If your marketing team was on board, they could have an internal marketing campaign in terms of testing out the culture on a particular thing, like, for instance, privacy, right? Who adopted privacy by design through their activity stage? Who ensured that they disclosed the personal information to be dealt with on this campaign? And how did they implement it for the website or for the software that we're building, all of that. And rewards, because your marketing team gave their budget for the rewards and incentive. And that also depends on the stage of your company, if your company has policies for all of that. But collaboration essentially helps with integration, because one of the challenges you might have initially faced in the start would be lack of integration with the existing processes. Now, if you did not collaborate with the rest of the business team, then that same issue would pop up again. You would not be able to have integration with current workflows or existing systems. You would not have been able to address or minimize the disruption to, or assume the perceived disruption to people's job roles, right? So integration is important, adoption is important. You're changing people's thought process or attitude for compliance. You're saying, before you do this, check with us. Before you roll out a product, check with us. Before, or maybe one of the touch points, your HR team, disciplinary procedures were not right, and you set up policies and you're checking so that it doesn't result in maybe unfair dismissal. Have we had those unfair dismissals? How do we measure that? So you need to have spoken to all of this team to communicate with them that we're driving towards a business goal, and every one of us is important to achieve this. The legal is not trying to stop your ideas. We're still trying to ensure that everything is streamlined. You're not inundated with anything. We're introducing this tool, but it's for the betterment of each of us and for the growth of the company. So collaborating with all of them also helps reduce your budget, right?
Mhm.
Which is a
Right.
very strong business case for the higher ups. So I know I reported as a CFO, and it was always important to talk about budget. So that was one of the major things, I always had to talk about budget. So if it's budget that's your strong point, please use it. So collaborate with all your team members.
Excellent. I just see a really good question coming in. It's actually a question for you, Teresa. I don't know whether you can see it in the chat. The question is around how do you achieve standardization of contracts as a startup business, considering the fact that as a startup, you're literally driving towards building a client base and get so much pushbacks. You see the question, Teresa? Maybe you can comment on that as well. I'm happy to comment as well, but it's an interesting one that probably a lot of organizations face, not only startups. I was with a client last week, which actually has an African parent company. I'm talking about this particular issue, and it all depends on your market position as well, whether you have the leverage to negotiate these agreements. But maybe, Teresa, as the question was directed to you, you want to comment on this one.
Yes, so thank you for that question. It's a good question, and it's something that we deal with internally. I think it just depends on where you sit in the negotiation room, at that moment. There are some instances where, you have to say, and so in that case, it could be your template, and then it becomes a take it or leave it scenario. And then in some instances, it's flipped. When you go into that negotiation room, one of the things you need to understand is a win-win. And so if you find yourself, on the other side, say, a startup negotiating with, let's say, an MTN, we're going to have our standardized templates. And to a certain extent, it's going to be standardized across our customers. So the likelihood of, making changes will be slim. In some instances, because the relationship is mutually beneficial, right? If you're able to make a good case, we can have deviations from the standard template. But in some instances, you have to know when, you take a win or when, you just move on to ensure that you meet business objectives. Because in the end, you don't want your business people to say that, the legal guys are, deal breakers or the department of no. And now, taking this internally, if I was in a startup, what would I do? I would accept my reality, right? And the reality is that there are just some big customers that we're just going to have to deal with their templates. Even in MTN, it's still the same thing. We have some big customers who issue their templates to us, and we have to review their templates. For instance, TikTok, they don't accept they don't accept the template of their customers. It has to be their template. And so there are people like that. So what you do is you create your own internal templates, knowing fully well that in some instances, there'll be negotiations and you would have to deviate from your template. Sometimes when you are reviewing the template of the other party or your counterparty, you can try to ensure that certain key provisions in your company's template is replicated in that document. That's the way to achieve a win-win if you're in a startup. Otherwise, you're just going to say, you know what, no, I'm not reviewing this contract. And then, your sales guys will not come to you and they will sign the contract and then you'll be dealing with, other issues. So thank you very much for that question. I hope.
Thank you, Teresa. And I think I would also add to that, if you're a startup, maybe standardization of your contract should not be your KPI, to be honest. I think it's KPIs should also be realistic, right? I mean, I think it needs to be within your control. If you agree as a team on a certain KPI, this is what we're going to do. We're going to drive to standardization, or we're going to reduce our outside counsel spend by X%. It needs to be a doable thing. If you're a startup, then maybe standardization of your agreements is not your most important KPI. Maybe your most important KPI is closing the contract fast and making sure that the business comes in and that the business starts earning money, so it continue to grow, right? So yeah, I mean, I think we're almost at the top of the hour. We have still 15 minutes left, I think, for Q&A. But I do also want to we did have a few other interesting things to to discuss, but we're a bit short on time. I think honestly, maybe jumping ahead a little bit. Can you comment on the panel? I don't know, Faith or Thomasin, who wants to go first, about what sort of skills do you need in a legal operations function as a leader, looking at driving change, doing process improvements in a function like legal? What sort of skill sets do you think you need for this, and your organization needs? Who wants to go first? Faith? Yeah, I see.
I can go. Yeah. Thank you, Hans. I think as a leader driving change in an organization, you need to be able to influence people. So there'll be different tiers of people depending on your stakeholder mapping. There'll be people who really want to know a lot, or people who are just pushing back and don't want to know about this change regardless of the benefits. So the skills in influencing others is quite critical. And then also just clarity on the purpose and intent of what you're implementing. So you need to understand and then communicate from a point of understanding what the change is, why it's happening, what impact it will have on various stakeholders, just to bring them along. So self-leadership is very important as well, because a lot at any given time may be changing. So how do you navigate that change? Also you as a person, and so that you can bring the team along with you. Yeah.
Good points. Thomasin, maybe some additional comments?
Yeah, when Faith said self-leadership, I totally agree, because it's difficult, it's difficult to drive change, but executive presence is very important. You need to have that executive presence. If you don't have it, I'm not sure how you would even communicate to the rest of the team. Then flexibility is also something that you need to have. You need to admit to yourself, just like when Hans said that, be realistic on your targets or your goals, right? If it's not realistic, don't set unrealistic timelines, right? You can pace yourself based on the readiness of the company and the team. So be realistic in setting your expectations, or even demanding some things from your team. And perception management, human beings are meaning-making machines. Your words, how you said this can mean something to this team. You don't ram things down on people. Yes, there's the should of how things should be, but there's also the as is. So you have to be patient in driving from the as is to the should, right? Or could, right? So be careful in how you couch your statement, your communication. Collaboration, like we said, is important. You might need the communications team or the IT department to use the intranet for driving consistent reinforcement on what you've been saying, right? Emotional intelligence, just to learn not to take things too personal, or, yes, you'll be overwhelmed. Yes, you'll be tired, but get support from people, associations, your friends, benchmark with, if you're in a multinational, benchmark with other subsidiaries, get support from your external consultants, audits from external or your internal team as well, just to drive that support and help you not be the only one. Then resilience, right? Be resilient and also appreciate your little wins. Incremental growth is great. We're gunning for 100%, but when you have 20%, it's very important. The one also important thing you need to have is analysis or data analysis, because when you're doing the assessment, of course, we're not saying go in depth into like the data analyst profession, but know how to analyze and present things for them to visualize, because storytelling is important. When you're saying, we went from point A to point B, you must have done an analysis to be able to communicate that. So storytelling is very important in change management or perception building. So I think with all of this and more, like the other panelists will add, then you'll be ready to go.
Good. Again, I'm encouraging people to ask questions in the chat. So please add them. We still have 10 minutes or so. I think you mentioned some great things. I think have any of you done any particular external training to get these skills? You mentioned executive presence. I think with that comes also the ability to convince others right, and influencing others. Have you done any training on this? Anybody want to comment on maybe getting some sort of training externally or internally? Could be as well. I don't know.
So, when Faith said self-development or self-leadership, it's also your commitment to yourself. As you're leading the company, you're also leading yourself because you have a vision for your personal growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because I have a personal vision for the kind of person I want to be, I'm a continuous learner, right? I take things, Coursera, free courses, I attend events, I talk to people like Hans, Faith, Teresa, just to ensure that my mind is always sharp and alert. So I just study, right? But I've also taken courses, from other training institutes like Lagos Business School, right? So maybe you might want to look into their professional courses or executive courses on things that address the specific thing. That's for those in Nigeria, at least, things you're working on. Or, just the free courses, really, TEDx talks, many of these things help, podcasts, just to keep your mind, and you're able to talk about different things in different departments, understand different stakeholders, because you've sort of gotten an insight into their own style of operation, how the business run. Even business knowledge helps you in communicating, because you're a business partner, so you need to know many things about business as well, so that your communication is clear and hits the mark for different stakeholders. So just self-leadership.
I couldn't agree more. I think, it's a really good point. And I think, like I said earlier, learning from your peers in the industry, learning other organizations through associations like these can help you a lot. I personally find a lot of information, helpful information on LinkedIn as well. Encourage everyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do share a few things here and there sometimes, but I think it's really helpful to get the information from different sources as well. So I think, I also say that I give you an example. I also once on change management, we were talking in my previous organization, we were talking a lot about change management. So I invited the HR organization to do a change management training with the entire senior team of the legal department, like 40 people. We spent a day training on change and why it's important, and the communications and all the things that we talked about today as well. And one of the senior lawyers, she was totally on board with everything, like totally fine. And then a few weeks after the training, she went away and changed the way of working of her team completely. And I don't know, she forgot everything she learned during the training, right? She didn't have a why, she didn't have a vision, she didn't have a communication. So, sometimes training, goes over people's head, I suppose. But it's still, I would say, very important. And indeed, talk to your HR organization. And one of the things that I found as well is, sometimes people will say, "Oh, there is no budget," right? But ask HR, because sometimes they do have a budget for every employee, including legal. It's just not being used, right? It's just not. It's there, but it's not being used sometimes. I think that's helpful. I don't see more questions. I would like to. Sorry, Faith, you have a question or a comment, maybe?
Yeah, no, just a small addition. The ACC platform also has quite a significant, plethora of training that is offered at various times, and some in recordings. So I have also tapped into that from time to time.
Yeah, it's really good. I think it's really helpful. And if there's anything, there's probably too much information. You need to find it. But I know that the team and people like Antje are always very happy to help. So I think it's really, really helpful. Can I, because we're almost out of time, I think, can I invite the panelists to share one closing remark, maybe one piece of advice? If you can give one item, one piece of wisdom for everyone on the call today, one sentence. Who goes first? Teresa?
Okay, thanks, Hans. One word, that would be always seek leadership support, both at the legal level and from your other C-suite executives. If you get that support, budget becomes unlocked, as well as, you get champions and influencers across the business. Thank you.
All right, Thomasin, final piece of advice.
Be patient, be hopeful. There's a lot of things you can do. So just tap into all the resources you have internally and externally. And yeah, that's it.
I like it. Hopeful. Be hopeful. Yeah, right. Faith.
Thank you, Hans. I think from mine, it's just to say, don't be afraid of the change. And it seems very obvious, a very obvious statement to give, but it can be quite daunting. But the change in itself will transform the way your department is working, the efficiencies, the timeline. So don't fear that change. Embrace it, adopt it, sell it, and just again, senior leadership, just have them on your side, communicate, and communicate yet again.
Well, that's really powerful, I think, and adopting the change and don't be afraid, I think, is a really good piece of advice. And I always like the concept of a change agent. I think, if you're in a legal operations role, even if it's not full-time, if it's a part-time legal operations role, I think it's part of your role to be a change agent or a leader of change, and you should not be afraid of it. We've all talked about the challenges and the complexities of change, and we also know that the world is continuously transforming, changing. There is a lot of disruption geopolitically, financially, and economically, both inside your organizations and outside the organizations. And you need to help the legal team and the legal organization and your business steer through these uncertainties and disruptions. And there's one big disruptor we haven't even talked about, which is technology and AI. Generative AI is going to cause significant change to the legal world. We don't know yet exactly how that will change and how it will affect the way that work is done. But technology and legal technology is definitely there to stay, and it's going to help organizations to be more efficient, but not only more efficient, but also deliver legal services in a better way. Tools will allow you to answer legal questions in a different way, more effectively, and tools will give you insights. There is more data that you can leverage around the way that you provide legal services to the organization. And if I sort of, in closing, summarize some of the aspects that we talked about around change management, I think, a few elements stand out, right? And it all starts with the vision. I think, why are you doing this, right? If you're leader, if your organization, you can't articulate why you need to do something, why you need to change something, why you need to implement a specific tool or a process, then I think you're not in a good place. You have to build strategic relationships and manage your stakeholders to get them along on the journey that you're about to do. And with that, you also need to inspire the team. Inspire. You talked about that, Faith. Embrace the change. Be a change agent. Don't be afraid of it. And inspire people. And we talked about finding the champions of change. Who is going to help you drive the process forward. At the same time, we talked about resistance. We talked about how it's important to understand that there will be resistance. Don't be surprised if there is resistance, because it's a given, right? It's a given that will be resistance, but identify it and try to manage it in the best way forward. And with that, you will need to influence people. You will need to maybe spend more time with certain people. You need to spend time with the people who are resistant, but get them on board. And finally, I think it's been mentioned by all of you on the panel several times, communication, right? I think communication throughout the process, it doesn't start with communication, it starts with communication, it ends with communication. It's an ongoing process. It never stops. Sometimes you see process flows, they go like this, right? Well, in a change process, they go like that. It's like it always comes around again, right? Because you keep going around on the communication of why you're doing it, why you would need to change. So I think, Anja, we're out of time. I would like to thank the panel, Faith, Thomasin, and Teresa, very much for your participation today. I thought it was a great discussion, great insights and information. I hope that everybody enjoyed it. I recommend that you leverage some of the resources that were shared in the chat and will be shared later on, I think, as well. I don't know, Anja or Cynthia, whether you want to sort of make a final statement at the end of our call today.
I just want to thank the panelists and our audience. You will hear from us with additional resources, and I believe you're going to host a second webinar later in the year. So more to come.
Good stuff.
Great job. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.